Ja, velkommen til høstens andre Europacafe. Europacafe, først skal jeg se litt om det. Det er et samarbeid mellom Europabevegelsen og Europeisk Ungdom. Og i kveld er det Europeisk Ungdom som står for arrangeringa. Det er en kafé som arrangeres med jevne mellomrom, og som skal være en arena for kritisk refleksjon og dialog om utviklinga i Europa og Norges forhold til EU. I kveld så er temaet Handelsavtalen, som er i ferd med å fremforhandles mellom EU og USA. Hva er bakgrunnen for denne handelsavtalen, som kommer til å bli verdens største handelsavtale? Og hva blir konsekvensene for verdenshandel og for Norge oppi alt det her? Panelet i kveld det består av Stian Øby Hansen, som sitter der. Han er doktorstipendiat ved Senteret for Europarett. William Taliaferro, som sitter der. Han er andre sekretær for politiske og økonomiske affærer ved den amerikanske ambassaden. Så har vi Martin Skylv på enden her, som er ambassaderåd for EUs delegasjon til Norge. Og så har vi Anne Louise Aartun By, som er seniorrådgiver for internasjonalisering og europapolitikk hos NHO. I kveld så har vi fått med oss Øyvind Brattberg, som er postdoktor ved Institutt for statsvitenskap, Universitetet i Oslo. Han skal være ordstyrer, så da gir vi ordet til deg. Vær så god.
Okay. Welcome to everyone. I should say welcome to myself as well, because I'm a stranger to this audience, and it's always a good thing to chair a debate where not only the panel but also most of the spectators know more about the topic than the chair. But there's a steep learning curve, which is always a good thing. Also, at least to academics, it is. I hope we'll manage to get some new insights tonight, which we should do, and we'll gain that insight in a topic that is, of course, of great relevance to us as well, even without being an EU member state. Of course, the implications of these trade negotiations are immense for us also. So I hope we can combine the broad European perspective with some Norwegian reflections as well. And we'll start all this by giving the word to each and everyone in the panel, and then we'll proceed with discussion afterwards. And according to I'm not sure if it's according to tradition, but at least we'll start with the American view. So I'll leave the floor and the word to William Taliaferro to say a few words about the U.S. perspective on this, and you can easily remain seated and proceed from there.
Excellent. Good stuff. I'll just okay, the voice of God. So yeah, just a couple of quick thoughts on what we're trying to accomplish with what I will just right from the get-go call the TTIP talks, and I hope that acronym is okay with everybody. Transatlantic, blah blah blah. So really, what this is mostly about is harmonizing the regulatory regimes of two of the world's most advanced economies. As I'm sure many of you know, the trade relationship between the United States and the EU is the largest in the world. It accounts for about a third of world trade. These two entities, the EU and the United States, account for about half of the economic activity in the world. So this is a very important negotiation that we're embarked on, partly because of what it implies for the rest of the world, and I'll get to that, and I hope you'll ask some questions about that as we go. Just to give you an example of the scale, I won't throw a lot of numbers at you, $2.6 billion a day in goods and services across the Atlantic. About $2 trillion in each direction in direct investment. About 13 million jobs, I don't know where that number comes from, it sounds small to me, are directly related to transatlantic trade. So there are two And I know I'm stretching a point a little in calling Europe one market. I know it's a single market, it's many countries. And so we're very cognizant of the fact that we're negotiating with an entity, but also with 27 negotiating partners. So in case anyone thinks it's easy, bear that in mind. They're two big economies. They're two highly regulated economies. They're advanced economies. And the objective, I should say right up front, is not to deregulate these economies. It's to harmonize highly regulated economies. I think that's a very important point because as an American diplomat, I'm well aware of the reputation that we have for wanting to deregulate everything and leave it up to markets. Really to eliminate unnecessary barriers to further trade and economic activity. And think about why I'm emphasizing regulatory and standards questions, which in some ways are the most boring aspect of international trade. Besides the fact that I'm a boring person, it's because we've largely eliminated tariffs and duties between these two markets. So what we now are getting into are what you could say are the fine points of trade between these two entities. So I would say that the negotiation that we're looking at now, I think it'd be precisely wrong to view this as a sign of failure or trouble between these two economies. It's precisely a sign of success. So what we've done up to now is we have developed very robust regulatory regimes, although separate ones, unfortunately. And we have eliminated most of the tariffs. So that's what we have to do. Now, the U.S. is looking for three sort of principles in our approach. One is transparency, so to provide advance notification of intent to regulate in some detail. Participation, get participation from across the board. Foreign and domestic participation, private and public, and so on. And then accountability. When you get input from all of the stakeholders, then you have to show to them that you've taken their input into account and provide a rationale for how you've done that and why. And I think a part of that is providing more accessibility to more stakeholders. We're really going international in a really conceptual way here. The idea is not to have just a trade agreement between these two entities, but to show the way for the rest of the world. We expect that this will be copied. We expect that the standards and regulatory approaches that we come at through these negotiations will be adopted very widely around the world. We hope so, because the whole world has gain to be made in doing that. And finally, one objective that we have to keep in mind is to establish mechanisms for future regulatory actions. After all, we live in a world where things are moving forward very quickly, and we need a better mechanism to deal with that, with things that are over the horizon. You know, when we invent an anti-gravity machine at last, we're going to need to anticipate how to regulate that thing. I think I'll stop there now that I've gotten to anti-gravity machines.
Anti-gravity is where we leave the US behind and we move to a European perspective, and that's for you to provide. Martin Skub, we await your comments.
Okay, thank you very much. So as I'm the second speaker, I will probably repeat a few elements which have already been said, which is, I guess, normal in this perspective because we would have a lot of common goals in this endeavor. So as Bill said, I mean, the EU and the US are amongst we work partners. I mean, we're probably the closest partners, around the world in many senses, both in economic terms and others. So we have been working together in the WTO regime for many years, where we have managed to create a sound framework for trade. And what we want now is to squeeze even more out of this relationship, basically. And obviously, as we talk about trade, this is for us, if you want to be honest, what we want to achieve is to create growth and jobs in the EU by delivering better access to the US market for EU exporters, and also, as Bill said, pave the way for global standards around the world. So Bill mentioned a few economic calculations. We have made some assessments of what this TTIP could mean if we have an ambitious agreement. That obviously different scenarios which have been used in our calculations. So the estimates show that the economy would grow between 0.5 and 1%, which would be the equivalent of 119 billion euros annually. For the US, a little less. Now, what we want to do in more concrete terms is we want to work on different aspects. First, to eliminate duties. But for duties, as Bill mentioned, this has already been done through the the WTO framework. The actual figures that we have show that on average in the EU there is a duty rate of 5% more or less, and for the US it's about 3.5%. Obviously, this is still a cost, and we would like to bring this further down, but this is not the main. These are not the main issues. So the main issues are really non-tariff barriers. So we want to work on other barriers. We want to work on investment protection, public procurement, the protection of the EU's geographical indications, mainly in the agricultural sector, facilitate customs formalities, work on rules of origin, on competition issues like having a dialogue on anti-subsidy, anti-dumping measures, etc. Now, as Bill mentioned, the regulatory barriers are more complicated, I think, than to reduce tariffs. Reduce tariffs is well, it's not easy, but you have to negotiate it. But here, on barriers, it's more difficult because you could say that they're not supposed to be trade barriers at all. And I say this because obviously regulation has a goal and will always remain, as William also mentioned. Why? Because some regulations have the objective to protect people's and consumers' health, safety. You have issues of financial security or environment. So obviously this is why we have all these regulations which have been established on both in the EU and in the US. But of course, some regulations, regulation also has a price, and has a price for international trade. For instance, regulations can block goods for entering a market by declaring them unsafe, for instance, or they can make imported products more expensive if you add additional costs, for instance, for testing or compliance. And obviously this leads that sometimes you have to pay a higher price to have high levels of protection. But it's not always like that, because we have seen that in different countries regulations can be different simply because regulators weren't aware that there were other ways to solve the problem that they were facing. Or maybe they have based the analysis on different scientific data. Or, to be honest, in the most extreme cases, because some domestic businesses actually have pressured for regulations to exclude foreign products from the market. So now, we believe that the negotiations which have started can make a difference on this, because we in the European Union have a strong experience on these matters. Why I say this is we have the single market, which has been now going on for about 20 years. And I think you could honestly say that it's the most advanced, most revolutionary experiment in regulatory cooperation, covering not only the EU, the 28, countries, but also Norway and Iceland and Liechtenstein. And here we have countries which have had different languages, different legal structures, different history, different regulatory cultures, and also different levels of economic development. But of course, I know that there was an article here by Ulf Sverdrup talking about a transatlantic EEA. This was the word that he used for the TTIP. And the TTIP will not create a single market between the EU and the US. It's not the objective either. But what we can do is to use our experience with the single market to support the work that we will do in the TTIP. And I think one of the ways that we will do it is through the fact that the single market is one of the highest level of consumer protection, environmental protection, and labor protection in the world. So we will maintain that. There doesn't need to be a trade-off between high standards and open markets. And then as the single market by definition is a system where goods and services can be sold across one market of 500 million people. So if your product is approved in one country, you can sell it everywhere. So there is no way that national regulations can block the free movement of goods. And also, we are also very interested in having a system which, as Bill also mentioned, it's to be open and transparent. We have a legislative process in the EU which is very open, very transparent, involving all the EU institutions, but also a lot of other stakeholders, not only inside of the EU, but also outside of the EU. So now, what we want to do in practice when we talk about the regulatory part of the TTIP, which is by far the most important, I mean, in economic terms, I think that 80% of the figures that I mentioned, which we estimate would be the gains from the most optimistic scenario, come from this regulatory harmonization or cooperation. So basically, the three elements here, we want to cooperate on, we establish ways to cooperate on future regulations to avoid unnecessary trade barriers. And we want to make existing regulations more compatible and also support the work through creating institutions which can then bring the work further ahead. And if I basically on future regulations, I think that the idea is when European and American regulators work on rules that are likely to affect the other side of the Atlantic, they need to have channels of information and communications from very early on, so that you could then minimize the differences in regulation on both sides and reduce costs. And on existing regulations, we need to see how we can make them more compatible. And we have in the reports which have been worked out for the European Commission, we will especially work in a series of sectors which are the most interesting and the most potentially economically interesting for us, like automobiles, chemicals, health, financial services, and ICT. And if I may mention an example, I mean, for instance, on cars, which is by way for the EU would be the potentially very interesting sector with a lot of estimated gains. I think that no one would doubt that there are, I mean, that cars in Europe or in the US are safe, I mean, safe to drive, but then yet we have a lot of safety regulations, for instance, on headlamps or windows or whatever. So now, maybe the regulators, when they will meet and discuss these matters, they can agree that you don't need to have exactly the same, but you can accept that the result, I mean, the level of safety is the same, and then you can sell your car straight away, so they don't need to comply with different sets of technical requirements. Now, on the institutional part, what the EU has proposed is that we establish a new regulatory cooperation council, where basically you put together the EU and the US regulatory agencies, so people who work directly in the EU and the US on these matters. So they would both monitor the implementation of the commitments which will be made, I mean, through the results of the negotiation, but also consider the priorities for their work. And they might also ask regulators to establish standards, joint standards, or work together in different matters. And now I would like to mention finally just 3 points which are important, because we've seen it already surface in the public debate in the EU, is that we will on lower standards. I mean, one thing which is which I can state for sure from the EU's point of view is that we will not agree under this agreement that that achieved a result which will lead to lower standards of protection. So it's not when we talk about regulatory convergence or cooperation, it's not about a race to the bottom. Thank you. And now the other thing is we will try to have an agreement with the Americans on the different sets of sectors and so on, but we will still, of course, no one, neither on the US side or the European side, will renounce the right to regulate in the future. I mean, it will still be in the EU, the European Commission, European Parliament, member states, etc., who will set the rules. So this will not change, and on the American side, it would not change either. This will still be the Congress, etc. And of course now this is not going to be either like you could call it a beauty contest where we will try to impose our rules or standards on cars to the Americans, which might be bigger but equally safe. We want to. This will not work. So what we have agreed is we will try to be pragmatic, work together to try to find ways. I mean, pragmatic ways to reduce cost for our exporters and create the expected gains. So this is basically our vision. I mean, and of course it's extremely ambitious. We have a very ambitious time schedule as well, which a lot of Norwegian commentators might have assessed to be unrealistic. Personally, I might agree on that, but still, I mean, it is a very it is by far, I mean, with the EU has a lot of negotiations and going on with different parts of the world, but this is really the, I mean, we will put all the efforts on this matter because this alone will achieve way more than all the other agreements that we're negotiating around the world with all the other partners in terms of economic importance. So we're sure that it's worth it. So now we have started, and we will recently in June, and we've had a meeting which had to be postponed, unfortunately, but the discussions will now start for real in the short future. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that comprehensive introduction. I think we'll return with some queries and questions, but we will first of all give the floor to the two other members of the panel. But I should just say that we've received a message from Brussels saying that we need to speak more deep into the microphone, which again goes to show that no Norwegian voice is heard clearly enough in Brussels. So it's yet another confirmation, I think. But if you yell loud enough, it's going to be heard nevertheless. And it's all due to not to telephone tapping, but to streaming. So we're being streamed to Brussels tonight. Speaking of Norwegian voices, we're now moving to not to the sidelines of this debate, but to the Norwegian perspective, and we'll give the word to Anne Louise Aartunby, who represents NHO, the Norwegian, the Confederation of Norwegian Enterprise in all this, and we're curious to hear your perspective.
Thank you. I'd like to stand, if that's okay.
Yes, as long as you speak into the microphone. And if you like this microphone, you.
Yes, please. It's a bit dark here. Thank you. Norway has a medium-sized open economy, heavily dependent on international relations and trade. Just think about the oil industry, the offshore services, shipping, and seafood. The EU is, as you all know, our most important trading partner. Approximately 80% of Norwegian total exports go to the EU, and 65% of Norwegian imports come from the EU. Our economy is therefore heavily dependent on developments in Europe. Since 1994, the EEA agreement has contributed to strong economic growth in Norway. Then what about the United States? Norway has always had a close relationship with the US because of shared values, close political and security cooperation, cultural ties, and extensive economic and trade relations. The US is our largest trading partner outside the EU. Trade with US represents 5% of Norwegian export and 5.5% of imports. The US market is an important market for many of our industry sectors. Oil accounts for more than half of Norwegian exports, followed by manufactured goods, machinery, transport equipment, and chemical products. The US is currently among the 10 largest markets for Norwegian farmed salmon, but is not among the most important markets for Norwegian fish as a whole. So, when Norway's most important trading partners are establishing a free trade agreement, how the Norwegian business sector views such an agreement. First of all, NHO supports a liberalization in world trade. NHO would like to see a new and more comprehensive WTO agreement to liberalize world trade. It is crucial to continue the dismantling of barriers that companies face in the global markets. It is therefore unfortunate that the WTO negotiations, the Doha round, have not been successful. In the absence of a new renewed agreement, free trade agreements are the way to go. The NHO therefore welcomes a transatlantic trade and investment partnership, or TTIP. If the TTIP succeeds, this will provide an unprecedented opportunity to boost competitiveness and generate jobs and growth, and thus creating a new bridge across the Atlantic. So what could be the effects of TTIP for Norwegian companies? It is without doubt that third countries will be affected by the TTIP. But exactly what the effect will be is difficult to say, because we don't know the outcome of the negotiations. However, we can make some reflections. The business sector believes that TTIP opens up great opportunities. If TTIP succeeds, the European and US companies will have almost free market access to each other's markets through the elimination of tariffs, reduced technical barriers, as we've heard, more use of mutual recognition and trade facilitation. To cut it short, an alignment of rules of the game between the two economic players with 800 million inhabitants thus creates a force in itself. As Martin said, 80% of the growth from the TTIP is assumed to come from the alignment of legislation. Due to our participation in the single market, the TTIP is likely to be beneficial also to Norwegian business. But a key objective for NHO is to ensure that Norwegian companies enjoy the same beneficial conditions as their European counterparts. Today, Norwegian enterprises view the US market as challenging. NHO carries out a quarterly survey among our members, and last quarter we asked additional questions about their relationship to the US market. Of those companies that answered these questions, a significant proportion of the companies stated that they are experiencing barriers in trade with the US. 1 of 4 experience barriers related to customs procedures. 1 of 4 of the companies experience technical barriers to trade. And 1 of 4 experience challenges in terms of investment. Almost 1 of 2 companies believes that if the EU and the US enters into a free trade agreement and Norway does not, it will be a disadvantage for the company. With the TTIP, Norwegian companies will meet increased competition from US firms in our European home market. It is therefore crucial that Norwegian firms also gain wider access to the US market. Although industrial tariffs in the US are low on average, with the exemption of agricultural products, clothing and shoes, a total elimination of tariffs could be important, especially for goods with high value and in sectors with high price competition. It is of vital importance that Norwegian companies be able to enjoy the same beneficial conditions as our European counterparts. Investments is an area that need more protection than a more comprehensive agreements than trade, because an investment is of a more long-term nature. The TTIP may lead to a situation where European and American companies and investors experience a higher level of protection and easier access to invest. It is important that Norwegian companies achieve the same protection. As Norway is not a full member of the EU, unfortunately, Norwegian influence on European regulations and standards may be further marginalized, as Norway will not participate in the joint working groups between the EU and the US, which adds essential guidelines for rules and standards valid for the entire European Economic Area. However, this will also depend on a dialogue between the EU and the EFTA side. And finally, it is not clear whether US will recognize approvals issued by the Norwegian conformity assessment bodies without an agreement with Norway. NHO therefore believes that the Norwegian government should follow the ongoing negotiations closely and work to ensure that Norway becomes part of the free trade area. To sum up, NHO welcomes the TTIP. This opens up great opportunities. However, Norwegian companies should not be put in a position where they are facing worse conditions than their counterparts from the European countries. And to be able to compete, we need a level playing field. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. We'll continue and end these introductory comments by giving the floor to Stian Øby Johansen. You prefer to remain seated as you are?
Yeah, I think that's fine.
That's all right.
If the sound in the microphone is good enough.
You will supply us with some judicial insights on the consequences of the treaty for the EU as well as for Norway's involvement in it, one should hope.
Yeah. Yes, my name is Stian Øby Johansen. I'm a PhD fellow at the University of Oslo Center for European Law. And I'm supposed to bring the lawyer's perspective into this, I guess, and also try and introduce the Norwegian perspective from a legal standpoint. But it's important to remember that what we are discussing today is an agreement that has yet to be made. So for lawyers, as me, we are usually backward-looking creatures, looking at agreements, texts, etc., that are already there. So today I'm speculating and predicting a future, which is a bit uncommon for me, and therefore, of course, but we have some things to work on. We have the political statements, which we have heard now just recently, and we have also some leaked information. I don't know if it's okay to say it in this forum, but the EU negotiation mandate has been, or an early draft of it or something like that has been available. So that's what I'm basing my guesses and comments basically on. But before I go into the TTIP as such, just a few words about Norway's position in these trade negotiations. Since we are not full EU members, as was just mentioned, we're formally outside these ongoing negotiations that are going on right now. But Norway has concluded a range of free trade agreements through its involvement in the EFTA, the European Free Trade Association. Even if it has a very pan-European sounding name, it only consists of Norway, Iceland, Liechtenstein, and Switzerland. So it's a small group, but nevertheless, they started out more or less following in the footsteps of the EU free trade agreements. And lately, actually, the EFTA has more or less been leading the way, making free trade agreements with third countries, and then the EU has come after often. So the EFTA has been testing the waters. But now, EU is moving first. So the EFTA countries will probably try, I guess, at a later stage to get a carbon copy of the TTIP for themselves. So that's why the TTIP can become also directly relevant for Norway, and I will comment a bit on that because that has some legal peculiarities, which I will come back to later. As for the TTIP in itself, the focus is strongly on non-tariff barriers, as we have heard. And while this was mentioned as a boring subject for lawyers, this is what we like about international trade generally, is these technical because this is really the harmonization of laws, of regulations that are legal frameworks. So but the way the TTIP is going to harmonize the regulations is not very legal, it seems, from the material I've been looking at. They envisage, of course, to have some standing bodies, but it's there seems to be mainly dialogue that's going to solve the harmonization problems. You're not going to see like supranational regulators in the transatlantic area, which is different than from the single market. So even if the aspirations are common to the single market, namely eliminate unnecessary regulatory barriers, the means to achieve that are different in that there's going to be more of a negotiation to it, and working together than having some supranational legislator. Another interesting feature about the TTIP, which is goes beyond the regular free trade agreements is the dimension of mutual recognition. I don't know if everyone is familiar with the term, but that means that the regulatory authorities in both countries will, or both countries will, or the EU and the US, not countries, to both markets, or will recognize each other's regulatory decisions. So if as we heard earlier, if the US car authority, whatever it's named, finds that a car is safe to drive on US roads, then it will also be accepted as safe to drive on European roads. This, of course, makes the life easier for those who produce cars, as they don't have firstly because they don't have to adapt their cars to different markets, but also because they can go to one office to get it approved. And the use of mutual recognition is very important in the single market in the EU. And I think this is at least one of the first times that you will see this on a greater scale in the international free trade agreement. However, the scope of mutual recognition is very uncertain, it seems to me, because what you need before you can do mutual recognition is that you need common rules. So I guess we have to see how much get harmonized, and then then from that you can build upon it with mutual recognition. Going from that to more of what I see as the hot topics, peculiarities of the agreement, I have 3 things that I want to point out. First, I find it somewhat interesting when it comes to the negotiations that they're now the ongoing spying scandal seems to might have some influence on the negotiations. I saw earlier that Martin Schulz, who is the president of the European Parliament, said that the EU should reconsider holding free trade talks with the US following the allegations that they have been spying on European leaders, mentioning that it could be difficult to negotiate with someone when you do not know whether they have internal information, etc. So that's interesting, but I don't think it will really throw a spanner in the works. But it's an interesting smaller issue, and I guess maybe the European Parliament wants to assert itself by using that kind of language. Secondly, a point that really struck me as a lawyer was that both the EU and the US seems to agree that they need bilateral investment treaty or bilateral investment protection systems in the treaty. This is what is commonly known by the abbreviation BITs, namely that you have and give investors that invest across borders, for instance, European investors investing in the US, a sort of bill of rights that protects their investment, such as protection from expropriation and for unfair and unequitable treatment. Not only are they given a bill of rights, the idea is also to have an international tribunal that will decide whether the investor's bill of rights have been violated. This is this is not only in the very exceptional circumstances necessarily. Some of these other BIT tribunals because these BIT often states will make these agreements separately. Here it will be a part of the trade agreement, but it doesn't really adjudicate over the trade issues, but only over investments. And what we see is that these tribunals usually stretch the meaning of terms such as expropriation very widely. So expropriation in some BIT cases have been used to challenge, for instance, new taxation regimes. So while it's hard to say how this tribunal will develop the law, it could be problematic as a point of the negotiation, because these tribunals are often criticized for their way of applying the law and for protecting investor rights much more than they protect the sovereignty of the people and the states and the democratic majority that chose, for instance, to raise taxation levels. And these tribunals are also not just intrastate tribunals. It will allow investors to directly sue the other states. So a European investor can then sue the US before this tribunal and claim reparations for any if he feels that he have been the subject of an expropriation or an indirect expropriation. But we'll see how this changes. But for Norway especially, this could be a very difficult point if we are to step in behind the EU and try to copy the TTIP. Because the Justice Department in Norway has concluded that BIT agreements violate the constitution because they have this supranational nature to them. So Norway stopped concluding BITs in the early 90s. But there are some disagreements whether the Justice Department standpoint is correct, and I guess I am of one of those that doesn't really feel that the Justice Department's reasoning is the best, because BITs aren't that much different from regular international tribunals that we're a part of, such as the European Convention on Human Rights. And also, the newly elected government has put negotiations of further BITs and conclusion of further BITs on their agenda, actually. So probably there will be some movement on this, but it could be a controversial point, because these tribunals have been very controversial, both domestically and internationally. And finally, I also want to... It's more of a question than a point, really, because U.S. law and U.S. politics is not my field, but I'm interested in seeing what will happen with the ratification of the TTIP in the US, because it seems to be very difficult to pass multilateral treaties past Congress. For example, the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea has not been passed, which is seen as even though the US sees it as more or less being reflective of customary law and therefore should be relatively unproblematic. Now there's some taxation things in the UNCLOS, the UN Convention, that are problematic, I see, but the BIT system, for instance, could be just as problematic for, I guess, Republican congressmen as the taxation authority in the UNCLOS. So I'm curious whether it would be possible to get the TTIP past Congress, especially since the NAFTA agreement has a similar BIT provisions, and that made it past Congress, but then afterwards, when they realized what they really entered into, and saw that this could also be used against the US and not only against the weaker countries, then at least from what I've heard, there was some opposition. So I'm just wondering, and that's, I guess, partly a question, like how will this fare with Congress, and what are the dialogues that the US authorities are having with the minority in Congress? Because 1/3 can block the ratification of the agreement. So that is all. Yes.
That is excellent. Thank you very much. I think before we proceed, we owe to stop by Mr. Taliaferro just for a couple of comments here. If you could respond to the final issue there about ratification, that would be very helpful. And I also wanted to throw in another issue, and that is whether you would be able to elaborate a bit on this agreement as part of the broader global strategy. Almost daily we read newspaper articles about the turn towards the Far East, and that Europe means less and less to America, and then you get these negotiations heading towards an agreement with what is perceived to be by far the most important trading partner. Could you just say a few words on this, about the broader strategy behind this, and also how this is perceived in light of the stranded WTO negotiations? Thank you.
Okay, thanks for those questions. Okay, first, the hard and I think probably impossible to answer question, is it ratifiable? You're asking me to predict what Congress does. Wow, I stopped doing that some time ago. I think the thinking in the administration is to address that very real problem by addressing the participation question very thoroughly. I think basically you take a lot of the wind out of the sails of opposition if you address the constituents' concerns right up front. And we'll be clear that opposition to trade agreements usually comes from people who have a vested interest in the status quo. It's less principled opposition than practical opposition. Now, having said that, there is some principled opposition. There are some in the U.S. Congress who hate the very idea of multilateral anything, who believe that the UN is, well, blue-helmeted, people who want to take over the United States. well, what to say about that? But anyway, yeah, I think there's a good strategy on taking care of constituent concerns right up front through a much more transparent than usual negotiation process. And I should say that we're already underway with this on our Trans-Pacific partnership, where we are going to great lengths to communicate what's going on at the table, not minute by minute, of course, because a certain degree of confidentiality is required, but making sure that those with a vested interest know what's going on, making sure that they have some input, and are as involved as practical in the process. Obviously, you can't have everyone at the negotiating table, but we'll do the best we can. So that's that. As to a global strategy, I guess I would express skepticism about the United States having a global strategy. I think people think we're more organized than we really are. But I guess I would see this as being somewhat opportunistic, as you might or might not know. While we were pursuing WTO progress, which I agree is pretty much stuck for now, we've been pursuing a number of bilateral FTAs. I think we have something on the order of 10 or 15 in process now. We saw an opportunity that came up in a separate process of sitting down with our partners in Europe and seeing really how can we optimize our trade relationship. And they sat down to look at this problem, not with a grand agreement in mind, I would have to say. It went to this panel, they looked at it and they said, you know what, you guys really should go for the goal line here and come up with a comprehensive agreement. So I think this is one of a number of free trade agreements that we're pursuing while the WTO is not making progress. That's the way to look at it. Now, this will be a grand slam, just to use a baseball metaphor, which is entirely inappropriate to a European audience. Sorry about that. But really going for a big win here is what we've decided to do. I think it's interesting that we were so public about the aspiration. I hope that answers your question. Yeah.
Very much so. I think we've already risen to a high level of knowledge from these introductions, but I suggest we open the floor for some questions from the audience. And if we could take 3 questions at a time, perhaps. You rise and shine, present your question, and please specify whether it's directed to anyone specific in the panel. Yes.
I have a question. I'm a colleague of Stians at the university. My doctoral research is in war crimes, and I sincerely hope this treaty will not be touching upon war crimes issues. But I did my master's of law in the States as a Fulbright scholar, so I'm a big fan of the U.S. Embassy. But while I was there, I didn't do that many subjects on trade law specifically, but I did do some basic subjects on the U.S. legal system. When I look at this negotiation in terms of harmonization, as you've all discussed, my big query is whether or not that will be reconcilable with the way the federal and state legislation is created in terms of consumer protection, for example, which I think is very differently conceived of in the States than what we have in Europe, where you have big cases bought by fancy lawyers, which now mean that McDonald's has a rule. This cup is hot, for example. That's how you bring legislation in the States. It's not via a top-down approach. And so when I think of harmonization and a dialogue without some sort of larger regulatory framework, I really question that approach altogether.
Excellent. Is there scope for a couple more? Yep. Yes.
While the TTIP is about liberalizing trade and trade and services, I wonder whether anybody is thinking about liberalizing the movement of employees or of entrepreneurs between Europe and the United States, as is in the case in the single market. Thank you.
Well, that's a good one. Is there a third question to be be asked. Yes.
I was wondering, thinking more just on the level of an individual consumer, would the advantages you have been speaking about also be applicable to the individual consumer? You would have no customs, like selling or exporting things across the Atlantic. And I guess when the negotiations goes through, ideally, this will be positive for the consumers in the markets concerned. But I guess it will also apply for Norway eventually if we become a part of it. Yeah. Thanks.
Excellent. There is some food for thought here. I wonder if we could start with the European view.
Yes, thank you. I will leave the federal and state question for my colleague. As far as I know, there is no discussion about free movement of labor, as in the EEA, but we will certainly address the issues of diplomas, as I understand things, because if you talk about enhanced trade, enhanced investments, and so on, we have now different company structures with big companies, where people move around, and this is important that you have a system whereby they can actually work and that the diplomas are recognized. So this is the one issue which will be addressed here. And the consumers, I think that the advantages will be twofold. First of all, they will that's behind. I mean, the whole idea of trade liberalization is to create cheaper goods and better, equally good goods. I mean, and the other expected gain is that the economies would grow, so general income would grow. And as I mentioned, some calculations show an average increase about 600 euros per household in the EU in the optimistic scenario. Thank you.
So now you want me to explain this federal versus state piece. You're right. That's a very real challenge, and this is going to be one of the really interesting points, not just of the negotiation, but of the ratification conversation too, because all of these levels of government. I mean, the United States, you'll note, is a plural. There are 50 states, and they each have their own governments. And then there is a federal level, and I hear, believe me, very regularly from people who are trying to do business in the United States that this is quite a problem for them from time to time. For instance, with water standards, states can specify water standards in addition to the federal government, which makes Norwegian shippers completely crazy. A good question. I don't know an answer to it. Same for our litigation regime. We have, every time I walk down an icy sidewalk in Oslo, I say, I hate our tort system, but they should have it here, because then you wouldn't have icy sidewalks. I think there's another consideration which we should be thinking about, and that'll be a challenge for the negotiators, and that's a fundamentally different approach to regulation, to protecting the public. I think in Europe you have far greater acceptance on a broad basis of the precautionary principle, and in the U.S. the approach tends to be more of a risk analysis, cost-benefit approach. That's a real challenge to work out. I don't think that's as tough as dealing with the strangeness of the U.S. Legal and legislative systems, though, because those can be reconciled a little bit more easily. I can conceive of how to get past that a little more easily than the others. But I wish I had an answer for how they're going to do that. But yeah.
I wonder if I could step in with a couple of questions as well to the panel. And the first one concerns the rather important concept of democracy, and that I think the European Commission would be an appropriate the appropriate entity to respond to that. Now, Martin, you said that there is no trade-off between high standards and open markets, but could there be that there is a trade-off between democracy and open markets, and how should that be be approached. Regulatory authorities are not really the source of of running democratic debates about how things should be, how different goods should be accepted and what kind of requirements they should be exposed to. But it might still be an issue, at least in this country, that by maintaining regulation at the national level, you maintain some sort of basic accountability that is lost once you reach the European level, but it goes even further when you take this from Europe and reach across the Atlantic as well. What would be your response to that?
Well, thank you. Yes, I mean, first I might remind you that with the Lisbon Treaty, one additional challenge, if I may talk about a challenge, is the fact that the European Parliament has increased powers in international trade agreements. So this was not the case in the past. Trade was, well, I think if you look back some years, seen as economy, and then all other issues like human rights or labor standards and environmental issues and so on should be addressed in other fora. I think that this has now changed, I mean, because the international trade agreements which are negotiated also include all these elements which I mentioned. Now, at the level of the EU, the negotiation, I mean, when you have a negotiation, you have a mandate which is, which is obviously not publicly, made public, but you, of course, the negotiators have to ensure that whatever the final output is will be accepted by the, in our case, by the European, Council and the European Parliament. Otherwise, the whole process will be just a waste of time. So, what will happen is that we have with the Council members in the Council, that is with the EU member states, we have something called the Trade Policy Committee. So the negotiators will regularly inform our member states of how things advance, and the same will happen with the Committee on International Trade in the European Parliament. Obviously, when you have to keep some level of confidentiality and you have to leave to the negotiators also to negotiate, to advance in the negotiations and be able to get a package and not be influenced by individuals or let's say individual interests from one side or the other. So this is, of course, in any negotiation which we have at the EU level, a bit of a challenge. You have to inform you have to make sure that the final product will be acceptable, and therefore you have to inform the decision makers. But on the other hand, you have to keep things in a small framework. But I don't think that there is an issue on democracy, because we will, at the end of the day, the decision makers, I mean, in our case, the Council and the Parliament, will be the ones who will adopt the agreement. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. Any other questions from me? Yes.
As the regulatory issues are the largest share of trade talks, there are still a couple of traditional trade issues also in the talks. I'm talking about the agricultural issue and the EU Common Agricultural Policy. It's a contentious issue. Was one of the reasons, I believe, why the Doha deal is deadlocked. How will the US accept any form of the CIP protection in Europe in this TTIP? And this is also relevant for Norway, as Norway is also a country traditionally has been protecting agriculture. And how will this fare when you have a TTIP and then you should implement this agreement into Norway, as agriculture is not part of the agreement at the moment?
I think we'll collect a couple more. Yes.
I was just wondering, now that the EU has a trade agreement with Canada, and they will probably have one with USA, will there be just a general trade agreement between NAFTA and the EU in the end? What do you think about that?
Who's expected to respond?
Just anyone.
Can you repeat the question, please?
Now, could you repeat the question even higher?
Now that the EU has a trade agreement with Canada and probably with the USA, will there be a general is it probable that there will be a general agreement between NAFTA and the EU in the end?
Is it probable that there will be a general agreement between NAFTA and the EU in the end, due to Canada being involved? Yes. If I may add a third one to the Norwegian side of the panel, and to Anne-Louise as NHO's representative here, we easily get into a discussion here where business is represented as a solid entity with shared interests across the board. But would there be any contrasting interests within Norwegian industry in relation to these trade negotiations and their outcome? Would there be any opposing interests between different areas of Norwegian industry? And secondly, you of course represent the business side of the equation, but the trade unions are not represented here. But could you just add a few comments on the potential conflicts of views there as well? Well, I'm not sure if both of you feel that questions here should be responded to.
Let me talk the common agricultural policy. Will we allow? I mean, that's precisely the point of negotiation. We have subsidies. The EU has subsidies. Heaven knows Norway has subsidies. I think we will be pressing on that, of course, because I've just named the succession of the amount of subsidies in order, actually. And I think it's certainly in the U.S. interest. I would argue that it's in the general interest to lower protections and subsidies for agricultural producers. I understand that there are reasons arguing otherwise, but I'm sure we'll be pushing for that. Will there be some compromise? I'm sure there will be. We will not get no subsidies. I think that's a fair prediction. We will not get zero protections, just because we all have farm lobbies. And getting back to the democracy question, that's how democracies work. We pay attention to our constituents. So I think it's fair to say we'll end up somewhere in the middle. I'm going to defer to the lawyer on whether NAFTA will apply necessarily. I think not necessarily, although it's a complicated question.
Yeah. About the EU NAFTA issue, would that be something you could address, Martin? If there is any proper response to that.
Yes, I mean, these negotiations are between the EU and the US. Obviously, we have received, a lot of attention, but not only from close partners, for instance, Turkey, which has a customs union with the EU, but also Norway and EFTA countries, Switzerland, and I imagine that the Americans have received similar attention from Mexico and Canada. But we have barely started negotiations, so this is a negotiation between the EU and the US, and we will then see how to keep our partners informed about and when and how to keep them informed about how we advance with these negotiations. On agriculture, I may mention that the idea when we started this whole TTIP process was to try to include or not to exclude, to have as few exclusions as possible from the outset, because if you would exclude this area, the other area, etc., then basically the probability to get a comprehensive and global agreement would be much reduced. So agriculture is included in the TTIP negotiations. I might mention that obviously the US has interests in products such as wheat or soya, but we in the EU are very competitive in, for instance, areas as spirits, wine, beer, and processed food in particular. So, for instance, cheeses, which we also like to export to Norway, as you know, and ham and chocolate. So we have today, a series of European food products which have cannot be sold at all to the US market, for instance, apples or some kinds of cheeses. And the tariffs are quite high on other products. So here I think there is, as there are tariffs on both sides, we will certainly not achieve full liberalization, but we will indeed hope and try to get a win-win agreement which would enable us to sell more of what we are good at, I mean, on both sides. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm no expert on the NAFTA agreement and how that works, but from what I understand, there's many more countries than just the US and Canada in NAFTA. You also have the Southern American states, and Mexico is a party too. Yeah. US, Mexico, Canada. Okay, so then you would have to include Mexico as well. But I think what is more realistic is what I mentioned earlier in my talk, is that you'll have these coming afterwards with separate agreements. I don't think it's very likely that you'll see one huge agreement. I think the EU and the US would probably, I guess, finish their negotiations, and that will be the template for further negotiations with other partners. And just also someone here mentioned that how they can expand this treaty to the EEA area. I just want to put down the law here that the EEA agreement cannot cover this treaty. You have to have a separate treaty between the EFTA countries, Norway, Switzerland, Liechtenstein, Iceland, and the US, if you're going to extend the TTIP to us. So that will mean new negotiations, but probably with the TTIP as a template, but it will mean negotiations. There's no automatic mechanism to just extend it.
Could I just add a question to that? What these different layers of negotiations followed by treaties, what does that entail for the conflict resolution mechanisms where the different parties do not agree?
Well, as far as I see from the TTIP, from the EU mandate at least, is that they don't really envisage conflict resolution on the harmonized standards. There's this BIT tribunal, which I talked about earlier, will only protect investments. And that will be an international mechanism that will protect investments, and you have rights as an investor. But the harmonized standards, whether they have been correctly implemented, you won't have, as far as I can see, any court mechanism that will check that or remedy deficiencies there, as we have in the EU with the European Court of Justice, which main task is really to check that these harmonization measures have been fulfilled. But then again, the way they're doing harmonization here is different than in the EU. You don't make it a supranational regulation that you try to enforce on your member states. Rather, you talk together and you find solutions. So if it doesn't work, the idea, I guess, is to just talk more and try to work out your differences.
Which means that if or when a cheese is blocked on the border, it will slowly mature while people keep negotiating.
I guess it'll stay there until it's ripe, or until they have decided what to do about it. Because generally the mechanisms that I see, at least from the very early documents I have seen, are only related to investor protection. So that would probably be pretty simple to hook, for instance, Norway up to that, because it seems that they want to have most of these investment protection treaties have arbitration tribunals. So you basically create the court for every individual case. I think they're going to have a standing body here. It seems like that, a standing court of sorts. But so then it should be fairly simple to hook Norway up to that regime if we're going to join in on investment protection, that is, because you have the constitutional issues, as I mentioned earlier.
And who will be in that body, that arbitration body?
Well, you will have lawyers, I guess. You would have international lawyers, experts in trade law that will probably either, if you have an arbitration body, you just have the parties will nominate for each individual case. But from what I saw in the preliminary papers here is that they want to have a standing body, basically an international court. And then you would nominate international trade lawyers that would sit there, and those lawyers that have experience from earlier BIT cases as arbiters, and they would be, well, I guess the most supreme judges you'd have in across the Atlantic. Basically, they would be able to say that, well, this U.S. tax regulation is in reality an expropriation, or this European law measure is in reality is unequitable treatment of U.S. companies, which is fairly could be fairly problematic from a sovereignty standpoint. That's also part of my puzzle about whether this is ratifiable. But yeah.
We'll open for a final round of questions, but just let Anne-Louise say a few words about the extent to which there is a common interest across industrial sectors.
Just one comment to BITS and the constitutional issues, because the last I heard from the Ministry of Trade was that the constitutional issues were kind of solved, and it was now mainly a political issue. And the last government, they didn't want to go into any new agreements, but the new government has in their platform this point that they want to go into to more bits and look into that issue. This is a bit difficult. I can hold it like that, much easier. When it comes to conflicting issues or contrasting issues in NHO, of course, in any negotiations, the parties will have offensive and defensive interests. And agricultural food production is always a difficult point in free trade negotiations. And our sectoral federation is also concerned about this point. A free trade agreement between the US and the EU may have an indirect effect on Norway, because the EU and the US companies are likely to become more competitive than Norwegian companies, and we will probably see more import competition. Regulatory issues is also a point, because if the EU agrees to change food regulations, especially connected to GMOs and hormones in beef, areas where the EU and the US are more, and US much more liberal than Norway, the same laws would apply to all EEA countries. On the more offensive side, we have the seafood industry, which is dependent on international markets. The seafood industry in Norway produces 35 million seafood dishes a day, every year, all year. So I mean, they're heavily dependent on trade, and would like to see more free trade agreements. For the Norwegian seafood industry, it will represent a major challenge if the US gets better access to the European market than the current condition is to Norway. About the labor organization and their concerns, I'm not sure actually what they've said about the TTIP, but in general they're concerned with the working standards and how this is reflected in free trade agreements. But what is the case in the TTIP here, I'm not sure. That is maybe for the EU or US side to say something about.
Thank you. Let's see if we can can just
one very brief comment on the constitution.
That must be very brief.
Okay. Just she said that the constitutional issue was solved. If they have solved it, then they must have changed their interpretation, because the constitution has not changed. So that was just my point, that this is still a contentious, I guess. But yeah, I'm one of those who favor the interpretation that BRTs are okay.
A final round of questions. Here, and here.
Yeah, I was wondering if I would like some more perspectives on the question: how would you predict this trade agreement will influence the EU and the US's relationship and work within the WTO, and work with agreements like the Doha round? and similar rounds.
Excellent. Bilateral trade and WTO.
I have a question in two parts. The first is on product regulations. I hear that you insist that you will not go down in standards from the EU standards, and the Americans say that this is not about deregulation. If I'm to take you seriously, that would mean that in every product category, one of the countries would see increased regulation and added cost. But of course, we shouldn't, because in practice, I assume that there will be a negotiation in each of the categories, and we will see a new set of regulations in each product category. So my question is, which sectors do you see where you think regulations will change the most dramatically for a given country? Another way of phrasing this is, where are the differences biggest? And the second part is, I was wondering if you could reflect just briefly if you had any worries or something to be skeptical about regarding harmonization. Some people might think that there's an argument in the United States that says 50 laboratories for experimentation, that you can get regulatory innovation by having different regulatory regimes, for example, or if you have any other things that you might say are negative about harmonization.
It's very good. Third one.
Yeah, thank you. If you don't consider horse meat scandals and that those kind of events, European food safety standards have traditionally, at least in Europe, been perceived to be higher than in the US, especially when it comes to trans fats, pesticide use, and especially the genetically modified organisms or hormones in meat. How do you envisage a solution to especially those four matters? Thank you.
With this speed, I think we could. This is a very short question. We could include that as well.
Yeah, I was just wondering. We haven't talked a lot about the environmental perspective in this situation as well. Perhaps not a short question or an answer, but at least a question. So I was wondering if you can both well on it from the EU or especially EU side with the 2020 strategy, but also from Norway. How does it affect our environmental politics with trading?
Okay, that is excellent. So we have the WTO. We have shortcomings of harmonization. We have horse meat, and we have the environment. And we have 4 minutes to spare. If we go beyond 7:30, we may be subject to regulation as well. Who knows in this country? But I will pose a challenge to the four of you. That is to address any of these issues that you prefer, and you'll do this as an exercise in brevity and efficiency. And we'll start on the Norwegian side, going the opposite way from where we started. And good luck.
Well, the only one of those questions I really feel qualified to say anything about would be, I guess, the WTO Doha question. And I guess what you could maybe see is that if you get first this big EU-US agreement and then a lot of follow-up agreements between the wider European area, Turkey, EFTA, Mexico, and on the North American side, Mexico, Canada, you might see the formation of and if these standards spread and this type of agreement spreads, then you might see that the Doha round gets unstuck if this becomes the new, I guess, norm. That's but then very hard to predict. We'll have to see.
Okay. When it comes to environmental politics and trade, I'm sorry, I don't think I'm fit to answer that question. When it comes to how this will influence bilateral agreements and the WTO, I think maybe it's possible to see that this is a step towards Maybe this could be a step towards a multilateral trade agreement, or get the WTO back on track, hopefully.
Okay, I'll be selective here as well. I think to start with horse meat and insecticides and GMOs, I think the real answer to that is to pursue very carefully a regulatory approach that is rigorously science-based and transparent. We have a lot of distance to go on that, I believe, on both sides, frankly. Negative aspects of harmonization: loss of control, loss of national control, loss of accountability to politicians, and that's a real, when you're just stretching your mind to think about what really this implies. Think about that. Where the difference is biggest, probably food and drugs would be my guess. Again, I'm not an expert on this. The influence on the WTO, I think it will lead the rest of the world, quite frankly, in the way that you predicted. But also it could incentivize a lot of other countries to really step up and make some progress in a WTO context, because this will be big if it works, and suddenly the rest of the world is out in the cold. I'll stop.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, on the GMOs and hormones, I said earlier that we have tried to include as much as possible in the negotiations, and these ones will probably be the impossible ones, or at least the very difficult ones. So the basic laws in the EU, which are now in place on GMOs, will not be part of the negotiations. However, there are some GMOs which are approved in the EU, for instance, for animal feed and so on. And there are some procedures to apply to use of them or compromise, so we will discuss all these issues. But probably we will have very high difficulties in achieving any advancement on that. And the same would apply for hormones, because the distance is too big. Now, on the environmental and trade labor issues, I can mention that in the free trade agreements that the EU has been negotiating around the world, we have included or tried to include as many issues as possible which we believe have a cross-linkage with trade aspects. There are certain limits, obviously. So, in particular, for instance, we have we consider a series of international agreements relevant for trade, having trade aspects or consequences. For instance, on the ILO, I mean the International Labour Organization, issues related to labor standards. There are conventions on endangered species. I just mentioned a few examples. Another one on biological diversity, or hazardous chemicals and pesticides, international trade. So all these international conventions which have relevance for trade will be subject, which relate to the environment, to the labor standards, etc., will be part of the discussions. And finally, I would say that on the impact of the WTO, we would have hoped for an agreement in the WTO, which frankly we have not been able to achieve, and the situation is stalled, and this is why we consider the pursuing a series of FTAs across the world is the second best solution. And I agree with my American colleague that we hope that this will create a new push for the WTO negotiations, and also create some international standards which are very high. Now, finally, on the question which we had from this side about whether one should compromise, I don't think that we need to compromise. Simply, if I take with the example, for instance, on cars, I mean, no one would be scared of driving an American car or a European car. Simply, we have we face a different situation, different traditions. We have, for instance, what have you? One country one would say we need 2 stop lamps, or we need 4, or whatever. So there are a series of details which basically we will try to achieve a joint agreement where, for instance, you would say that if you comply with these standards without going into all the details, then you can sell your car on one side or the other. So in this example, I think we have already a series of examples. For instance, on electrical cars, which is a new area, increasing an area where you see an increasing production. There has been a lot of cooperation already on both sides on standards for batteries or the plugs or the what have you, so that you will not develop in different directions and then have to coordinate afterwards. So this is the whole idea, and we will focus on the, as I mentioned, on the sectors which have the most importance for our businesses. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. I should say that never has so much been owed by so many to such an excellent panel. It's been a good debate, and I think we all should also take note of that the first prerequisite of a thriving democracy is to have an informed debate, and that is something that the European movement should continue doing. And by the end of this debate, we all know a lot more about what issues and debates hide behind the TTIP acronym. And we now know that it's not something you buy in a pharmacy, but it's an acronym, covering important issues to all of us. Yes, I think we should invite the organizers. Is there any final words to be said? Any European aspirations to be shared? Now is the moment.
I haven't planned anything, but we have bought a couple of wine bottles.
Yeah.
As a thank you.
European wine?
Yeah, I don't know. It's,
We like to call it European agricultural product.
yeah. Thank you all for coming. It's been a pleasure to sitting here and listening to you. I'll continue in Norwegian. Det sånn at Europacafe er noe som skjer med jevne mellomrom, så bare følg med på Facebook-pagen. Det finnes en Facebook-page både for Europeisk Ungdom, Europabevegelsen og Europacafe. Så hvis dere er skikkelig engasjert, så er det bare å følge med der. Og så er det sånn at vi kommer til å stå og dele ut litt informasjon om Europeisk Ungdom ved døra for dem som er interessert i det. Ja, da takker vi for oppmøtet, og så ønsker vi vel hjem. Yes.